Hi, I'm coming to you live from Keller, Virginia, and I thought I would try this method of adding to the discussion board. This is my friend Thomas Cole. He's a literary cat. I very much have been enjoying the discussion boards. I'm sorry I didn't jump in on the Mrs. Mallard and Story of an Hour discussion board until today, but there are a few things I want to discuss with you there. First of all, I thought it was very interesting how some of you thought that Mrs. Mallard dying at the end was sort of like karma, or sort of God sort of getting her for having a callous reaction to her husband's death. It's kind of interesting. A lot of readers actually read it that that was the only way she could be free, was to be dead, because at the time the only way for a woman to be able to live independently, respectfully, and in a way that wouldn't be judged harshly by society was through widowhood. Remember, women aren't allowed to vote, women aren't allowed to hold property, and women basically are either the property of their fathers or husbands. And so Mrs. Mallard, some of you said that the conflict was Mrs. Mallard being happy, sort of, that her husband was dead. I want to remind you that that might have been more of a problem for you, or for readers. But you're right in that Mrs. Mallard does, the joy that she feels is described as a monstrous joy. A monstrous joy. So she knows she shouldn't be feeling that way, and yet she can't help but think about the possibility of living just for herself. With climax of stories, they're usually near the end. So some of you said the climax of the story was either when she locked herself in the room and began to realize the potential of a free life, or when her husband died. That was the climax, but that is not correct, because the climax needs to necessarily come near the end and should solve the problem or struggle. So if Mrs. Mallard was having this problem or struggle with feeling happy or joyful at the thought of being independent now that her husband is dead, the climax comes and that gets resolved when she immediately loses that and dies at the end of a joy that kills, as many of you noted, is very ironic. So I also wanted to comment on Liz's and Susan's post about conflict being internal. I think a lot of you implied that that was the conflict, an internal one within Mrs. Mallard. That was good to use that term, internal conflict. And someone had mentioned, it might have been Nicole, that the conflict had to do with societal pressure, societal expectations for roles for men and women within a marriage, and that too is true. So there's not always one answer or by itself to what a conflict in a story can be, but basically we have a woman here who is confined and feeling confined and trapped in a marriage, and who's given this opportunity to perhaps be free. Some of you said that she must have been in love with her husband at some time. If you recall, and some of you will use the line, sometimes she had loved him. Actually, the line says she had loved him, period, sometimes. And then the next sentence is often she had not. So she never did really love him. But he wasn't mean to her. His hands were folded, the tender hands were folded in death, and the face that never looked at her except with love. So really it's just the institution of marriage, not the particular or personal Mr. Mallard. So I think those were the main things I wanted to say. And the last thing, I guess, is about bringing our own experiences into the reading. Some of us may have been a little bit shocked or offended that Mrs. Mallard would feel joyful. Dawn had noted that she brings her own experiences in and maybe had taken things a little more negatively. And Ellen brings in the same point. But I want you all to know that we do, as readers, bring in our own experiences. And we do have to be careful not to rely just on those and miss things in the text because we're just reading from our own experience. So the discussion was very rich, and you all have been doing a very good job. And I hope that we can continue having rich discussions in our English 112 discussion board. From Keller, Virginia, I'm going to sign off. Thomas, say goodbye. All right.